Two interviews being posted now are from highly intelligent men from different ends of the political spectrum in Australia. Peter Baldwin served in the Hawke Labor government, and Tony Abbott, of course, is extremely well known in more recent times as a former Prime Minister and a thinker at large. Both men are people that I respect greatly. They have a different perspective on good policy, but both have a deep commitment to improving Australia and the society we live in according to the way they see the world. More importantly, what emerges from these two talks, I think, is that they both respect and understand the need for debate, perhaps robust, but debate. Debate that is respectful, that can be vigorous, but which focuses on the issues, not on the personalities. I hope you'll find them both interesting. I suggest that looking at one would necessitate looking at the other. Tony, good to see you, good to be with you.
Thanks, John.
We've known one another for probably the best part of 40 years. We're university contemporaries, we served together in government for a long time. We've sat around cabinet tables together, we've been on poly pedals, we both love the outdoors, we both would see ourselves as students of history. One of the things I know about you is that you have a very deep commitment indeed to liberal participatory democracy of the sort that we enjoy. They say that the West is built on ideas. Mm-hmm. What do you think those key ideas were?
Thanks, John. Look, it's great to be with you, and we do go back a long way, and I wish you were still in the Parliament. But
glad someone does.
But look, there's the ethical foundation and the intellectual foundation. The ethical foundation is essentially the Gospels. The intellectual foundation is essentially the Greeks. And if you look at the Gospels, what were the two fundamental insights which Western civilization is built on? They were first the uniqueness and the dignity of every human being. Second, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, or love your neighbour as you love yourself. And then from the Greeks, I guess we got this basic attitude where we question everything. Now, it has to be a respectful questioning, because if it's not, it can easily be destructive. But if you've got a respectful interrogation of what is, you get closer towards what should be. And that's been the wonder of our civilization and our culture. For 2,000 years, we have constantly improved in almost everything because we have questioned everything in a spirit of respect, and we have treated other people decently. That's the guts of it.
There are many, of course, who would say that it's nonsense to say that our Christian underpinnings had anything to do with this. It all comes from the Enlightenment.
But the the people, John, who were responsible for the Enlightenment were people who were absolutely shaped and formed by Christianity. They weren't necessarily devout believers. Some of them thought their way out of faith, but nevertheless they were shaped and formed by it, and their thinking bears its imprint. So the idea that you could have Western civilization with the Enlightenment without everything upon which that was originally built, I just think is misconceived.
It's worth noting, I think, that nearly all the Enlightenment figures, if not all, the serious leaders, actually regarded women as inferior to men. Mm-hmm. They were racist, and they believed that slavery was part of the natural order of things.
Well, like everyone, they're on a journey, and the point in the journey at which we have currently arrived is not necessarily the point where we will end up, or indeed the point where we should ultimately be. And they were all products of their times.
There's a point I wanted to make about and we've seen quite a debate about this in recent times, the impact of the Enlightenment and how it's responsible for our freedoms and so forth. I think, as you say, it's part of a journey. In fact, if you go to something as horrendous as slavery, the moral impulse from that actually clearly, undeniably came from a band of very dedicated Christian believers who saw that, followed properly, Christianity did not allow for a distinction between black and white or master and slave. And actually they fought the orthodoxy of the day, and it was trench warfare for a very, very long time.
It was self-interest versus ideals, and thankfully, in the end, the ideals won.
Another major figure, of course, it's not technically true that he said it, but his views were summarised in that famous quote, that I may disagree with you, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. Seems to me that implies two things. The first is, no matter how much you and I might disagree, if we accept that Christian creed that you have worth and dignity and standing that is equal to mine, then I have an obligation to recognise that you have every right to put your views on the table. So there's respect. The other aspect of it is there's a recognition you don't get good public policy out of a bad debate or a truncated or a silenced debate. If you really want to make progress, you've got to have every idea on the table, and it's the idea that you then pull apart, or the ideas, and not the denigration of the other person.
Look, it's the old story. You've got to play the ball and not the man, so to speak. And the problem that we've got at the moment is that if you say something which is beyond a certain pale, instead of being taken seriously as an advocate, you are damned as some kind of a heretic. Now, every age has probably had its own version of heresy and heresy hunters. Every age has probably had its own version of burning heretics at the stake. We don't do it literally in the West, at least, thank God. But certainly we treat people as pariahs if they transgress. Now, I think there are some transgressions which probably do deserve judgment, but there are many people today who are unfairly pilloried for saying things which, at least until recently, would have been conventional wisdom. But I guess social change has been swift. It's important we don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. I mean, it's important that we grow and learn and change, but it's also important that we preserve the best in our heritage, and I certainly want to ensure that we respect that which is best in our past, we honour that which has made us, and we build on our strengths.
It's said that the West, in its great years, if you like, combined a sort of a culture, a dignity culture, with a respect culture and an integrity culture. And so you're esteemed if you're a person of character, of courage, of compassion, and you're expected to be dignified in the way you carried yourself and behaved in public. And a blend of those two things made you an esteemed member of a community. And the better you were at those things, perhaps the more esteemed you were. But that this is now breaking down. And what we're seeing is the emergence, in the name of identity politics, of a sort of victim culture, where to be esteemed, it seems that you have to be able to say, woe is me, I've been mistreated, and many people are. The point is how you handle the people who feel victimised. But we've almost reached the point now where we want to promote everyone's sense of entitlement. Do you see a danger in this?
In the end, all of us are a combination of many things. I mean, in my case, I'm a male Australian who's married, who lives in a certain area, who has a certain job, and all of these things feed into my identity. But the moral quality of an individual is not determined by identities. The moral quality of an individual is determined by the decency, the strength, the character, as you say, and the cardinal virtues are the cardinal virtues today as always.
Yeah, one of the things that concerns me is that in perhaps not thinking through how we handle people who have had tougher circumstances, who are able to paint themselves as victims, we are encouraging this sense of entitlement. And you see, the problem to some extent is that if you feel you're entitled and that you're owed something, you don't appreciate it when others do things for you. But again, sometimes I wonder whether we're not taking this too far. The English academic, now a man who's been around for a long time, Frank Furedi, has written a book about what's gone wrong in our universities. He says that we've made a terrible mistake. We've weaponised feelings. So now you're seeing courses and their contents written to avoid raising issues that might be contentious, that might offend people, and we're backing it up in academia with a whole lot of things that are actually really very dangerous, from anti-microaggression policies through to the requirement for academics to provide trigger warnings if something worrying might be said that might offend somebody, even if it's true, through to safe places where people can go and find cuddly toys and a counsellor and maybe a friendly dog, through to platform denying.
And we just need to face the fact that the truth sometimes hurts, and we can't run away from the truth just because the facts might be uncomfortable. If I've committed a crime, the facts will be paraded in court. They should be paraded in court, and if that hurts my feelings, well, that's just something that has to happen.
Well, these are interesting things to ponder, because he would argue that, in fact, Australia's universities are particularly bad at this. We've picked up some of the easiest and laziest models out of the US, where we're seeing some universities almost eat themselves out from within, where left-wing academics are being denied a platform because they haven't fallen into line with the latest fashion and what have you. In fact, the IPA, having a look at Australian universities, found that only one of our 42 universities has no restrictions on free speech over and above the laws of the land.
It is extraordinary. I spent some wonderful formative years at university in Sydney, as we both did, and subsequently in England. And I've got to say that I have nothing but affection and nostalgia even for my days at university, and the debates in those days were very robust and nothing was off limits. And yes, you got a very vigorous response often, particularly if you were putting forward a conservative position. But in those days at least, there was no official attempt at censorship. Certainly your opponents would try to shout you down, but I guess that's the nature of student assemblies. They're pretty rowdy. But the idea that the university authorities should say that some things are off limits, I think that's just wrong. The whole point of a university is to question everything, to ask and re-ask the big questions over and over again, constantly trying to get better answers through a dialectical process. I mean, that's the way it has to work if our universities are to do their job and to serve the purpose which has made them over the centuries such engines of progress.
And yet now you have serious left-of-centre thinkers right around the world warning that that's precisely the opposite of what is now happening.
Well,
that instead of expanding young people's horizons, instead of giving them an opportunity, almost encouraging them to stretch the boundaries,
and to try new things. They're actually being told what they can't think. They're having boundaries put around what's right and what's wrong. They're not allowed to test things and explore. They're coming out unable to understand another perspective.
I think all of us, John, have grappled with this question of how do we produce better schools with better teaching so that we have stronger and more accomplished citizens. I think we've all wrestled with that, and as federal politicians, part of the difficulty is that it's state governments that run state schools, and historically it's been state governments that set the curricula, and the curricula have been rather contaminated by these sorts of thoughts as well. I mean, how, for instance, do you have feminist algebra, for instance, or Indigenous science? I mean, yes, there are women who've contributed to maths, and there are Indigenous people who've contributed to our understanding of how to cope in a harsh environment. But how do you have these cultural concepts permeate the hard sciences is a mystery to me. But anyway, so how do we fix it? Well, I think that what everyone should get is a grounding in the classics of the Western canon, starting with the New Testament, then going with Shakespeare and Dickens and the best of the modern authors. I think they need to have a grounding in history, starting with the ancient civilizations, going through the Greeks and the Romans, the development of Britain, the rise of the modern world. That's what people need. They need to know about the best that has been thought and said and done over the centuries, and if they know about that, then they will have a foundation upon which to try to be the best they can be today and into the future. Now, for this to happen properly, we need to have more of our best and brightest going into teaching. And sadly, for quite some time now, teaching has often been seen as an also-rans profession. You don't earn much money, you don't get much recognition, and under those circumstances, it's hardly surprising that it's not something that the best and brightest often choose to do. Now, there are many good teachers despite all that, but if I could wave a magic wand and change things in our country, it would be a stronger presence of the Western canon in our schools, and it would be more of our best and brightest teaching there.
Well, you would find a great friend in Winston Churchill, who unquestionably was the greatest defender of freedom the world has seen in the last 150 years. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And he said freedom actually depends upon the next generation being taught what has gone before them. He actually said that in 1934. And he said, if you don't teach it, you leave people open to Marx's dictum that if people unaware of their heritage are easily persuaded. It seems to me that we're looking at a society that's very easily persuaded.
And young people naturally look for heroes. They look for role models. Now, these days, often enough, they find them in sport or in the movies, in the entertainment industry, and that's all fair enough. But there are marvellous stories, real stories of real people who have done magnificent things for others, and we should be familiar with that.
It encourages me that a lot of young people go to Anzac services every year, and that has to do with recognising character, an old-fashioned word that perhaps we don't use enough.
And this is a sense, this is an often inchoate sense that people have that there were ordinary people who did extraordinary things because they felt the call of duty and service.
My personal view is that the West is in a very, very bad state, but that Australia is one of the few Western countries that ought to be able to say its best days are still in front of it. We're in the happening part of the world. We're in Asia. We're not yet, and I want to stress that word yet, crippled by government debt and the sort of problems of unfunded liabilities going forward that the Europeans and the Americans have got. We're a young and energetic people. Our best days ought to be in front of us.
I agree.
But are they?
Well, look,
Likely to be?
I'm optimistic, John. I think that in the end, the better angels of our nature will prevail. I am, I guess, just inherently optimistic because, again, if you look at the history, bad times always pass. And at the end of the bad times, we usually have learnt some important lessons which we put to good use, and there are better times. So look, I'm optimistic, but there are obvious problems. At a trivial level, there's the kind of, I suppose, snake pit of Canberra. At a more serious level, there's the debt and deficit problem, which we don't show any real appetite to fix. There's the conflict between environmental and economic desiderata, which I think is very serious. There are some environmental costs to much that is economically desirable, and yet if we do not sustain a strong economy, we cannot go forward as a people. Ultimately, we cannot even protect the environment if we don't have a strong economy as well. So these are big challenges that we need to come better to grips with in the years ahead than we have in the recent past. Now, all of us would like to reduce emissions, but reducing emissions at the cost of people's jobs, reducing emissions if it means putting people's cost of living through the roof, reducing emissions if it means deindustrialising our country, particularly given that we could have zero emissions here in Australia and just 1 year's worth of emissions increase in China will completely obliterate any emissions reduction here. Look, there's a lack of logic, there's a perversity about all of this, and I think we have to
lack of
tackle
logic worries me. So does what I think is the underlying problem that allows that lack of logic, which is selfishness. Let me put it this way.
Or a misguided idealism, because the people who loudly protest against coal mines or gas drilling or whatever it might be, they think they are doing it for the right reasons. I don't for a second doubt their idealism. I just think that it is going to end up doing vastly more harm than good, and people need to understand that all of the things that we take for granted in a country like Australia require energy, affordable, reliable energy. You've got to have a mining industry if you're going to have a modern standard of living. So all of these efforts to curtail them or even to close them are ultimately incredibly counterproductive.
You mentioned idealism there, and that's important, of course, particularly for young people. It'd be very sad if they weren't idealistic. But I do feel very strongly that one of the things we need to be honestly pointing out to young people is that we can have a great society now. Ideally, we should pay for it as we go, or if we don't pay for it as we go, we accept lower living standards. The only other option is, frankly, to ask our children to pay for the good society we want to enjoy now. Intergenerational theft.
Exactly right. I can remember that was the exact phrase you used to me as we were discussing the 2014 budget. We have to end the intergenerational theft. We have to stop ripping off our children and our grandchildren by spending today money that they will have to repay. Now, I think this is as plain as the nose on your face, but as we saw, the 2014 budget was sabotaged in the Senate after having been effectively demonised in the public arena, including by people who should have known better, coalition state premiers, as well as the Labor opposition which had created all of this. I dare say if Joe Hockey and I had been better salesmen, it might have had a better outcome, but it was certainly an honest and I think gutsy attempt to come to grips with the problem, and the substantial destruction of the 2014 budget is a baleful legacy that will haunt government for a long time to come.
We'll come back to that in a moment if I could, but before we do, we're talking about young people, and if any young people come to watch this, I think the thing that you and I would want to say to them is we actually do very deeply care, because we're deeply invested in your age group, by definition. Can we just come to what sort of society we would want them to enjoy? It's obvious, I think we'd want them to be free from, oppression of a military kind. We want them to have economic opportunities. We want them to, have satisfying careers. But we want them, I think, to live in what you and I have enjoyed, a society that is a good society. It's a lot more than simply being one that's about money.
The great thing about Australians is that we don't wait for other people to do what needs to be done. If we see a problem, we roll up our sleeves and we have a go at fixing it. Surf lifesaving clubs, volunteer bushfire brigades, sports clubs are all wonderful manifestations of that self-help. If you've got an elderly neighbour whose grass is getting very long, you just pull out the mower and you mow it for them. If you haven't seen someone who lives down the street for a while and you know they're not well, you knock on the door and see how they're getting on. I mean, that's the spirit which we cherish and which needs to be fostered. Smiling at people in the street and saying g'day rather than just walking anonymously past. I mean, this characterises Australia. It's a feature of all the English-speaking societies, but it's particularly strong here. So that instinctive looking out for the other person, that I hope will remain at the heart of Australia and our way of life. But yes, we need to be safe, we need to be prosperous, we need to be decent, and we also need to be strong, because we can't let ourselves be pushed around or intimidated. And as you said at the start, it's an insecure world, and we need to acknowledge that and be adequately prepared for it.
Jumping then to two final big picture issues, both of them I think very important. We're used to, perhaps we've taken for granted, being part of the Western Alliance, and particularly since the collapse of the Berlin Wall, there's been almost a sort of a unipolar-led, US-led global order that we've kind of taken for granted. You could say that's breaking down now. We're seeing the emergence of a multipolar world, re-emergence of Russia, China, South China Seas, the rogue states, so on and so forth. A bit hard to know where Australia might fit into that. It's a more dangerous world. How do you think we should be positioning ourselves?
I think we should work as closely as possible with our allies, led by the United States. I think we should cultivate the best possible relationships with other significant countries, appreciating that with some of them it will be hard to have a values relationship, although we may well have an interests relationship with them. And I think we need to make ourselves as strong as we reasonably can be, knowing that in the end no one will fight harder for Australia than Australians.
Coming to politics today, I've been out of it a decade, you're still involved. What's changed?
The characteristic of the Howard government was strong teamwork. And yes, there were tensions inside the government from time to time. Excuse me. Different people had occasionally frustrated ambitions. Notwithstanding all of that, there was a wonderful teamwork that characterised the Howard government until the last few months. And there hasn't been a lot of teamwork on either side of politics since then. We saw the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd disaster. There's been a lot of disappointment, obviously, with what's happened on our side of politics over the last 4 years. I don't say that I'm perfect where these things are concerned, but nevertheless, all of us should be ambitious for the higher things, not just for the higher job. In the end, all of us have got to be in it for the country and for the party, not for ourselves. And I don't believe that the current era is as selfless as earlier eras have been.
It's an interesting point that you make there. To focus for a moment on the Senate, I personally have become truly afraid that the Senate is now endangering the nation's future. We often had difficulties negotiating things through the Senate. I think of the GST, but I think actually of the raw courage of a Meg Lees. And in my own case, even John Woodley, who was a Democrat, I had to deal with him directly on all the transport-related issues, which were very big because of the fuel excise and reforms and so forth we were planning. I won't say they were easy, but you felt you were dealing with honourable people who, according to their view of the country, wanted to take it forward. I'll be blunt and say that my impression is that we now have quite a few senators who have no long-term view for the nation at all, and some who I suspect essentially loathe our way of life, that don't really support it, that really have ulterior motives well, to put it bluntly, they're not really in favour of liberal, participatory, capitalistic democracies in the way that you and I would advocate. Am I going too far?
I am very reluctant to question the good faith of anyone, although I think that it's easy to become a kind of a political exhibitionist in the Senate, and I think some people succumb to that temptation. But look, what's happened over the last couple of decades, we've had the disintegration of the Australian Democrats, who tried to be a centre party. We've had the rise of the Greens, who are a very left-wing party. We've had, I guess, a lot of intransigence by the official opposition, and some would say I had a role in that. But most of all, we've had a change in the I suppose, culture of the Senate. It's gone from being a house of review to a house of rejection. And that's become very problematic because under the former Labor government, a whole lot of things that were once part of appropriations bills are now part of separate legislation. 85% of Commonwealth spending is enshrined in legislation, which means that if you want to make savings, you've got to argue it line by line, clause by clause through the Senate. You can't just say, oh, well, we've made these savings in the appropriations bill, by convention the Senate must pass it. So it is now almost impossible to get savings through the Senate unless they are sponsored by the Labor Party, because the coalition is disposed to support savings. Labor is disposed to reject savings unless, of course, they make them themselves. So I think that the changing culture of the Senate, the changes in 1984, which mean that to get 4 out of 6 senators at a half Senate election in any one state, you've got to get 58% of the vote. So the changing size of the Senate has made good government from the centre right almost impossible. because we won't have a majority in our own right. The Labor Party will, for political reasons, oppose us if they're in opposition. The only deals you can do with the Greens are bad deals, and corralling a majority of the crossbench, or corralling nearly all of the crossbench, given they are such an eclectic, to put it at its kindest group, is all but impossible.
I think this is a very serious challenge for all of us in Australia. My own view of it, as I look from outside now, is that the Australian people don't really like any of the major parties anymore. They're disillusioned with politics. Not sure it's entirely fair, because in some ways I think if they're divided in Canberra, that reflects a divided community. There's a lack of core consensus on common values, ideals, commitment to the next generation included in that. To be critical, because I'm an elector now, and I can sit from both sides. On the other hand, it does seem to be a reality that people are saying we no longer want the Senate controlled by the parties. We don't want it to be so much. A lot of Australians are saying we don't want it to be a creature of the parties. Well, what do we do? Because we don't want the country ground into gridlock.
Again, I think people want contradictory things. They want the Senate to be a check on the arrogance of the executive government, but they don't want government to become gridlock either. And so every time they vote for a celebrity candidate rather than for either the Liberal Party or the Labor Party, either the Coalition or the ALP, you contribute to the very problem that we now lament, namely ineffectual government, politicians who say one thing before the election but don't do it after the election because the Senate won't let them. Because the Senate won't let them. Now, I think it's a huge problem, and everyone says it's impossible to change the Constitution, but if it were me, I'd be going to the next election with a simultaneous referendum on Section 57 to amend the Constitution to say that if the Senate rejects legislation twice, 3 months apart, you can then proceed directly to a joint sitting of both houses without the need for a double dissolution election. So I think this would have the effect, if it were passed, of turning the Senate back into a house of review, which it should be. I mean, governments don't always get it right. Sometimes the executive government does have a rush of blood to the head, and it should rethink. So the Senate serves a useful purpose, particularly if the government doesn't have a majority. But if, having thought it all through, heard the debates, had the public inspect all this, if the government still believes it's the right thing to do, it ought to be able to get the legislation through and the public can have their say at the next election, which, let's face it, can be no more than 3 years away.
Well, I think this is a major issue for the nation. Let's say in the build-up to the next election, one of the things we really need to focus on as Australians is what do we want the Senate to do? Tony, it's been great talking to you.
Thanks, John. Lovely to catch up.
And you.